So now let's get started. Please join me in welcoming for our first session, which is a fireside chat between the Privacy Commissioner of Canada, Philippe Dufresne, and Sarah Clodman, Chief Public Affairs and Governance Officer with the Canadian Marketing Association. They're discussing a matter that is very close to my heart, the indispensable role of marketing in driving business success, innovation, and economic growth in today's digital landscape. Welcome, Philippe and Sarah.
Thank you, Allison. And it's my great pleasure to introduce the Commissioner in a little bit more detail. He accepted his role 2.5 years ago and quickly established himself as a thoughtful regulator, emphasizing, among other things, a commitment to open dialogue with the business community. This has proven to be true, and we at the CMA very much appreciate his time and that of his senior leadership team speaking to us on various occasions. Commissioner Dufresne is currently the chair of the Canadian Digital Regulators Forum, and he is also active in international privacy forums, collaborating with regulators worldwide. Welcome, Commissioner. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Sarah. Very happy to be here.
Thank you. Let's start with the priorities for the OPC for the upcoming year, and perhaps you could share how these might change if Bill C-27 does or does not proceed. For example, in the absence of a new law, would the OPC attempt to fill the void with more regulation?
Sure, thank you. And just want to take this opportunity to thank you again, Sarah and Allison and the CMA for this opportunity and for the leadership that you and the CMA has in Canada and through Canada around the world. And I have so appreciated in every single one of our exchanges your professionalism, passion, integrity, and significant contribution. And I love the concept of a fireside chat. I was looking up the history of that, and it was coined describing the radio addresses that Franklin D. Roosevelt would have to discuss really complex economic and social issues like banking reform and so on in the Great Depression. And I think it's absolutely appropriate as we discuss the equally challenging, if not more challenging, issues of privacy and innovation and the need to balance that with a strong economy. So to your question, I think that we have identified 3 strategic priorities. And whether they will change or not with law reform, I think the short answer is no, because those priorities anticipated the possibility of C-27 being adopted and also the possibility that it would not be adopted. So those are, 1, maximizing the impact that the OPC can have in protecting and promoting the fundamental right to privacy. And so that looks at things like our governance process at the OPC, the use of our resources, the use of our technological tools, the creation and strengthening of our partnerships and the collaborations with organizations like the CMA, but also with partners in Canada, whether in the privacy community, but also in cross-regulatory spheres like competition and CRTC. And you mentioned the chairing of the CDRF that I'm very committed to and very proud to be able to work with my fellow regulators. Also with the international partnerships as well, and with civil society and academia. So that priority, and when we launched it, we were explicit in saying we're going to be preparing for law reform for C-27, but we're also going to be preparing for the alternative scenario if Parliament does not adopt it for whatever reason, including the lack of time, which is a possibility. And if that happens, then our focus turns on, well, it already is there. How do we use our existing tools? How do we use the many resources and tools that we already have in PIPEDA, in the Privacy Act, whether it be our investigative tools and how we can do that proactively, perhaps preventively, making sure that we can resolve matters early on, making sure that we target our guidance to ongoing issues that perhaps will be important and true with C-27 or not. So codes of practice, for example, we're going to be dealing with codes of practice if we have C-27, but even if we don't, there's now more powers to share information in the banking sector to prevent fraud and terrorism and money laundering. And that's going to be done on the basis of codes of practice. So there are real opportunities there to put our focus in those existing tools that we have. Second priority was addressing the privacy impacts of emerging technologies. And so obviously that's going to continue with C-27 or not. We're focusing on AI. We're focusing on biometric information. We're focusing in the future to quantum, to neural rights, to anything that will come. How do we make sure that we can continue to maximize innovation and economic success while protecting the fundamental right to privacy? And the third is championing children's privacy. And so there again, we've made recommendations, as you have, on C27 to protect minors, to protect children. We're consulting on age assurance. We're going to continue to do that with C27 or without C27. And so that's at an overall level. And of course, we're going to be open to hearing feedback from industry, including the CMA. And I want to take a moment to thank the CMA for its many useful contributions to the consultation process. You've done it overall with C27. You've done it with our age assurance consultation process. You've done it with our strategic priorities. And good and useful feedback that I have very much reflected on and acted on. And just very recently, I was in Europe for the G7 meeting of my fellow DPAs. And in discussions, I was talking about very insightful and appropriate comment that you made on the strategic priorities, that we didn't have enough mentioned in there about innovation and about the importance to pursue innovation. And that was an absolutely valid point that you made and that I've been reflecting on. And so that's an example of very, very relevant contributions. You also made a very good contribution on consultation itself, and saying that we should consult ideally before having a draft paper, so that that early consultation can build the draft itself. And we've done that in our age assurance process. So look forward to the development, and of course continue to support the adoption of C27, and I'm cautiously optimistic about that, but I will be prepared for all eventualities.
Thank you, Commissioner. And you've covered a lot of ground, and I'd like to delve a little bit more into some of those areas that you raised. So maybe I'll start with, I have some questions if C27 does proceed, and I have a few questions in the event that it doesn't. So we won't play odds today. I think that would be pretty difficult, but we could talk about the two scenarios. So in the event that it doesn't proceed, we do face the prospect in Canada of having a patchwork of provincial laws, potentially resulting in varying standards, which would create a great deal of complexity for organizations and confusion for consumers, and would certainly not create a better landscape of protection for consumer privacy. So do you see a role for your office in promoting a coordinated approach, even in the absence of a federal law?
I do, Sarah, and we are working on that already with the provincial territorial colleagues from a privacy standpoint. So we have regular meetings now. It's since one of the nice things since the pandemic is that we have monthly meetings with the FPT commissioner. Used to be, I'm told, that it was a yearly thing with the annual meeting. But with the pandemic, this good habit developed, and it's continued, obviously, on a virtual basis. We do meet in person annually, and we've recently done that in Toronto. So that group is very important. We exchange views, challenges, and we work together to adopt joint statements, joint resolutions, where we really try to say, okay, what are the common principles there? There are different laws, there are different, you look to Quebec in particular, different, perhaps more specific obligations, perhaps stronger obligations, different powers in terms of some having order-making powers. Quebec has a possibility of fine. So there are these things, but there are much, much more common elements. And so focusing on those, we issue statements and resolutions, such as the one we did on digital ID, such as the one that we did on AI, responsible use of AI. We've done one on protecting the privacy of young people, and with both statements of principles and some aspirational statements, but also statements about our expectations and how we see those principles. We're also jointly investigating in certain cases, including OpenAI and TikTok, and the recent decision of the Court of Appeal in the Facebook case that flowed from a joint investigation as well with BC. So we're leveraging the ability that we have to work together. And I was also this fall before the Alberta Legislature Committee to speak with my colleague from Alberta and my colleague from British Columbia about their law reform in Alberta. And they're facing the similar challenges. Well, what's going to happen with C-27? Should we wait for C-27 before we proceed? So these discussions are ongoing. They need to be ongoing with industry and to hear the perspective of are there specific issues that from your standpoint you see as particular roadblocks, but we're trying to use the tools that we have, both within privacy, but also beyond privacy regulators. And this is the role that this still new Canadian Digital Regulators Network is looking at in terms of making sure that we can coordinate that work even between privacy and competition authorities, or privacy and broadcasting authorities. So this is more and more important because, as you know, privacy, innovation, the economy, it touches many different laws, both within the privacy world, but also beyond.
That's great. And circling back to the federal, provincial, territorial privacy regulators, well, I was very happy to hear you say a few moments ago that you shared some of the CMA's views, then you share those views on the innovation aspect at the G7 meeting, and that it's important for privacy regulators to keep that in mind. So does some of that conversation happen as well at the federal, provincial, territorial table? And is there some understanding across the country that on the part of regulators that there are two aspects to privacy law and both are important?
I think so. I think so that we're looking at applying our laws, but not in a vacuum. And I think as regulators, and I think this is one of the reasons why it's important to have these exchanges and to have this understanding about what is the environment that we're in, what are the entities that we're regulating, what are the particular challenges that are being faced in our sectors and in the provinces with their particular industry. And certainly when I was appearing in Alberta, having discussions with my colleagues about, okay, well, this is meant to modernize privacy laws, but it's also meant to strengthen Alberta's economy in this context and in the context of the economy overall, but also specifically vis-a-vis AI. So these discussions are absolutely ongoing. And again, having an understanding of the industry that's being regulated is critical when we think about the recent amendments on banking laws, for example. Understanding the challenges of money laundering and terrorism financing and why there's a desire to have more exchange of information is absolutely critical. And that's also why we're working with the competition authorities and CRTC to make sure that we not only understand the industry that we're regulating, but we also understand the fellow regulators that we're working alongside.
Yeah, that's great. And so this is a reference to the Canadian Digital Regulators Forum, which is a relatively new forum. And I know the Competition Bureau, the CRTC, and the OPC, obviously, and recently the copyright regulator as well has joined. So I know it's fairly new and that its role is evolving, but how do you see it evolving, and when do you think organizations might feel a different experience as a result of the forum's work?
Right. Well, I think that it is certainly becoming more and more important and more understood by regulators in Canada, but also around the world. So at the recent G7 DPA roundtable in Rome, we had many discussions on our priorities, which include data free flow with trust, which include emerging technologies, which includes enforcement collaboration. And we were explicitly talking about the need to do this collaboration with other regulators in other spheres. Why? Because we want to make sure, we want to avoid the zero-sum game. We want to avoid pitting our mandate of privacy against another regulator's mandate of competition law or national security or copyright. And so that's something that resonates with me. It's one of the first things I said as privacy commissioner, that I wanted privacy to support the public interest and support innovation, and to avoid making these choices where you're going to be sacrificing one important element for another. That's something I think that resonates in the submissions the CMA has made on, in particular, C27, but otherwise, I find that you are identifying these risks of impacts on other aspects. And so we're having this discussion. We're doing some use case. We did this summer the first privacy sweep with privacy authorities and competition authorities, focusing on deceptive design practices, dark patterns, identifying some of those techniques where complex and confusing language or interface interference or nagging or these techniques which make designs not as meaningful, not as transparent. So we've identified a number of areas where organizations were, in our view, falling short on that, and we're using some of those practices. But we were able to do that as an international community, but also as a cross-regulatory community, because both from a privacy standpoint, we had concerns, and we have concerns with these techniques in terms of the consent and the awareness and transparency, particularly for children. But competition authorities also face those similar concerns. And so I think you're going to see more and more of that. I'm going to be meeting with the OECD in a few weeks to discuss that with them as well, and with an international frame of mind. So bringing in the OECD brings in governments as well. And so what industry will see, I think, is a greater awareness from each of the individual regulators to this notion of avoiding a zero-sum game. And so if you're raising issues in a given matter, to say, well, have you thought of the privacy implications here in a competition matter, or broadcasting, or the copyright implications? I think you will see a greater awareness, a greater openness of regulators on those aspects. In my chairing of this group, I'm hoping to have concrete products in terms of looking at synthetic media and drawing perhaps some lines of commonalities or themes or trends from the various regulatory frameworks. Over time, one of the recommendations I've made for C27 is to allow formal collaboration and investigations between regulators in Canada. One of the paradoxes is that I can do a joint investigation with the FTC in the US, but I can't do that with the Competition Bureau here in Canada. So I think that's a paradox. We should address that. But for now, we cannot do that. So you're not going to see immediately these joint investigations, but you're going to see joint statements and joint awareness building on those issues.
Okay, great. And I noticed also that you signed a memorandum of understanding this summer, I believe, with the U.S. Federal Communications Commission. Can you add something about that?
Well, that's right. And that's another example about, we're working closely with the Competition Bureau, we're working closely with the CRTC, and we're doing that internationally. So that MOU with the FCC this summer was an important step in that direction. Again, recognizing that there are some important areas of overlap, in particular cybersecurity, where there'll be some privacy aspects, there'll be some broadcasting aspects, there'll be opportunities to work together. In Canada, that arose with the CRTC in the context of C11, where the issues of algorithmics, recommendations for Canadian content came up, and that raised potential privacy issues. And in my submissions to Parliament, I recommended that we adopt privacy as one of the policy objectives of broadcasting. That was accepted, and also noted that there was a possibility for my office to appear before the CRTC to make submissions on a matter that could raise privacy issues. So that's an important trend. It doesn't have to be that every single case that has a privacy element comes to under my jurisdiction. There may well be things that don't, but to have that opportunity for collaboration is important. I think it's going to be important in the elections context, where the whole discussion about the applying privacy law to political parties is going on. Currently, there's a bill before Parliament, Bill C-65, that would strengthen the privacy obligations for political parties, but it would not give my office jurisdiction over those complaints. It would put it with the Commissioner for Canada Elections and with the Chief Electoral Officer. And I have close relationships with both of them. We've already had discussions about, well, if that happens, how can we work together so that I could provide our knowledge and expertise on that front and make it work as best it can. So I think we're going to continue to see that more and more. So far, I was speaking at a competition law summit earlier this fall, and there was a great openness and interest in that from industry, from the community. So we're going to continue that work.
Yeah, I think it's very important to make sure there's some level of collaboration and consistency, because obviously it's difficult when companies have to comply with conflicting rules. And so to the extent that there is discussion and commonality, that's a very good thing. So let's now just talk for a moment about the possibility that CPPA will become law, Bill C-27. So I have two questions under that scenario. The first is, if that becomes law, then you will have order-making powers and the ability to impose fines on organizations. Do you see that as leading to the end of early resolution, or do you see your new powers as a last resort, or would it be something in between?
Well, I think if it's up to me, early resolution is always going to be a priority. I think that if we can resolve matters quickly at the front end, prevent them, and also I think ideally communicate those early successes. That is an important goal, and that's something I want to see more of that with C-27 or without C-27. So one specific example where we did this was with Airbnb, where we had a complaint about their practices in terms of cameras on the premises that people rent, and whether it was transparent enough, and whether you had that. And it was very, very interesting discussions about, well, some people wanted cameras for safety reasons, but we raised questions about the awareness. People were not aware that some of those cameras were in the house, in the living room, in local areas. It wasn't clear enough. Most people would think that the cameras would be outside the house, not in the bedroom or things like that. So we engaged with them, and they've agreed to change the policy. They've announced that, and we were able to applaud that without the need for a full investigation from beginning to end. So that's a success story. I want to see more of those types of things. Some cases will require a fulsome investigation and a fulsome finding at the end of the day, and I think that's good. And it's legitimate for organizations to disagree with our recommendations and sometimes go to court to the end. That's fine. That brings clarification, but you don't want that to be the standard in every case. I don't think it's a good use of anybody's resources, not mine, not yours, not the courts. So the more that we can do this, the better. I think that the order-making power, I think the ability to have fines, whether I'm the one that imposes them or there's a tribunal that does so following recommendations, at the end of the day, these are good things in my view, because they bring an incentive, another incentive to early resolutions. I find that certainly in my experience so far, Canadian organizations have been very, very mindful and very committed to resolving matters and to following the recommendations. But that's not always going to be the case. It's not always the case. And sometimes you need that extra leverage. I've heard that from industry leaders. I've heard that people saying without that threat, it's harder to sometimes convince the board of decision makers to invest significant amounts of money to solve something. So I think these are very important tools, but I do want to see them as a last resort. And I think that the CPPA, certainly the C-27, that comes through. It's very much meant to factor in also due diligence approaches of organizations. And the code of practice example, I think, is another important innovation from C-27, where once you have a code of practice, once you have a certification program that would be approved by my office, if you're complying with that, then it gives you certain protections. If there's a complaint, I can decide to dismiss that complaint on the basis of a certification program having been complied with. And it also has impacts in my ability to recommend fines. So that's an important incentive, I think, for organizations. And it's something that was explicitly highlighted in an OECD report surveying industry leaders and lawyers about how these codes of practice and programs, they're expensive to set up. So there needs to be some some reward at the end of it. So looking forward to continuing work on those specific codes, but also at an international level, the global CBPR is a code of practice system that we've been quite engaged with our international partners, Japan, US, UK. So we're going to continue work in that direction. And that was one of the topics we discussed at the G7 roundtable, where we specifically compared the CBPR to the GDPR, and showing that this as an alternative, but not obviously not the same type of approach, but a complementary one.
Commissioner, I'm sad to say that we're just about out of time, so I'm going to skip to my last question, because I'd really like to know if after your 2.5 years in the role as Privacy Commissioner, if you could just share your thoughts about the marketing profession. And I'm wondering if there's anything that has surprised you or anything you'd like marketers to know moving forward.
Well, it's not something that surprised me, but I want marketers to know how I appreciate the professionalism and the excellence and the ethics and the thoughtfulness that you bring to the work that you do. I read the recommendations that you make. I've reread them recently in preparation for this, and I was reminded of how impressive and thoughtful they are. You were part of the development of PIPEDA itself, and coming up with a lot of the key principles that are continuing to serve us, and that I'm using on a day-to-day basis. And your submissions talking about the impacts of proposed legislative measures, the impacts of the work of regulators, how you highlight how your profession of marketer is much more than advertising, but it's really about understanding consumers, generating that trust and that loyalty, and again highlighting the economic aspects and the implications of regulations, and in some cases potential over-regulation. So I think that's hugely valuable. I think that the recommendations that you make are done in a way that's very useful for regulators such as myself, but also for legislators, for parliamentarians. I used to be the top lawyer for parliamentarians, so I think I understand them a little bit in terms of what's useful and what's not. And your submissions are absolutely useful and thoughtful. So very grateful for that. Very grateful for the openness that I've really felt since I've started in this role, and your willingness to listen and to speak, and to give good views and helpful views. And again, we don't always agree on everything, and that's fine and that's normal. But I appreciate the feedback that you've given, and including and in particular when you see things that we could do better as an office. I welcome that. I'll continue to welcome that. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Commissioner. It's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time today, and look forward to continuing the conversation.